Hey, is this thing on? Hi. My name is Aaron.
I'm Kulan.
And I'm Alina.
For the last 6 months, we've been researching, exploring, and documenting the history of a small house in Glen Carlin. Embedded in that house is the entire history of Arlington County and the stories of everyone who has lived there. Our story begins in present-day Arlington. Welcome to Arlington. Today, 250,000 people call this county home. Arlington represents a phenomenon of urban growth in the United States. It lies beneath the shadow of neighboring Washington, D.C., and as a result, Arlington is often overlooked. Beneath the rapidly changing landscape of Arlington are centuries of local history, unbeknown even to many of the county's longtime residents. At the root of this growing community lies a hidden gem. This is the oldest house in Arlington, the Ball Sellers House. Built in 1742, the house is older than the United States itself and hails from a time when the landscape of Arlington looked very different.
This is a very extraordinarily rural area. I have seen nothing in Arlington today that is like that. There's plenty of trees, but it's trees and brambles, it's trees and bushes, it's trees and little things. This is just straight up trees, and that is really hard to imagine. It's so foreign to everywhere else we are, whether we're on computers or cell phones. None of that existed, it's just the house. It shows the entire history of Arlington, and in some cases, tied into national history. It's all reflected in that house. And it is a miracle that it exists. We refurbished the house in the 1970s to be as close as possible to what John Ball would have lived in. So when you come to the house and you step onto the floor, you're stepping into the artifact. That is, you've just been transported 280 odd years back into history. And that is where John and his wife Elizabeth and 5 girls lived. We have a bed there. We have a table that's set up with food as if they just walked out.
The area, part of the budding British colonies, was sparsely populated. John Ball and his family were some of the earliest known residents of what would later become Arlington County. The land had been stolen from the Native Americans and was owned by King Charles II. The land was eventually passed down to Lord Fairfax, whose Virginia property was so expansive that it extended from the Appalachian Mountains into present-day Arlington.
Lord Fairfax really wanted to have families living there. He wanted to make it a community. He had really low, basically rent fees, patent fees, for families who would come up and live on the land.
Lord Fairfax, hoping to spur development on his property, granted a small plot of land to a man named John Ball. With this plot of land, John Ball began construction of the oldest house in Arlington. The Ball family was comprised of John Ball, his wife Elizabeth Ball, and their 5 daughters. The entire 7-person family lived in the one-room, hand-built house, cooking, eating, and working together all the time. The girls slept in the attic and shared 2 small beds. John and Elizabeth slept together in a bed downstairs by the fire. There wasn't much privacy in the Ball Sellers house.
He and his family were pretty self-sufficient. What kind of jobs would all these little girls have been doing? They would have been doing as much as any little boy would have done. The hauling water, and you just name it, and they were doing it. So these girls were pooped, right? This family is working.
To get a better sense of what it was like to live in the house, we sat down with the house's current resident and caretaker, Margaret Wagner.
I think it would have been an adventure living here in the frontier back in 1750, because John Ball brought his wife and 5 daughters to live out in the woods. Basically, there was no civilization. The nearest town was in Alexandria, but they didn't really know what to expect. They probably brought as much as they could carry in a wagon and built the cabin from scratch, taking down the trees themselves, shaping the wood themselves. And I'm sure the daughters were excited and probably a little scared. They would have to get along really well. I think the daughters would have to be really, really tight. Like, they'd probably spend a lot of time taking care of each other and telling stories to each other and having adventures out here.
We know John Ball died in 1766, and the girls could not own any land, neither could his wife. And his wife, she was supposed to move out of the house and go someplace else. She didn't want to do that.
When John Ball died in 1766, he left a will that directed all of his property to be sold and the proceeds to be split equally among his wife and daughters. However, conflict arose. John Ball's wife, who had devoted much of her life to the property, refused to leave.
She didn't want to go live with her daughter. She wanted to stay in the house that she'd been in for 30 years. The girls, they launched a lawsuit saying that they didn't want to be pushed out, but it tells us a couple things about the girls. It tells us that they didn't want to go anyplace either. They wanted to keep some kind of control over the land. The other thing it tells us about the girls is that they could read. That's kind of an interesting thing. They had to read to know what they were signing and what they were reading, and that they could read the will. We also know that there were books in the house. That tells you gives you a little tiny insight into the lives of this family.
The Ball family made a lasting impression on Arlington. Ball's descendants scattered all over Arlington. The Ball family eventually moved on, but the house remained. In 1872, the Washington and Ohio Railroad put a station and train stops adjacent to the Ball Sellers' house.
The rail system was starting up, and so you'd be able to spend a day trip outside of DC where it's hot and stinky and boring, and you would come out to the country and have a picnic at Carlin Springs.
The third and last generation of the Carlin family took advantage of the station by creating, of all things, a family resort. The Carlins also added some additions to the house, including the stylish 1880s extension that adjoined the cabin and the giant wisteria vine that is still there to this day. Burdett and Curtis began to develop Carlin Springs Resort into what is now Glen Carlin. Streets were laid out in 1891, but the names were different from what they are today. They were all names of trees. In 1896, the area was renamed from Carlin Springs to Glen Carlin. The Carlin Springs Resort, built by the Carlin family, was eventually torn down in 1893. Burdett, Curtis, and then Arlington County used the Carlin and Ball family names frequently when naming local landmarks. It's evident that Arlington did not want its history to be forgotten.
After the Civil War, Arlington had already started to become a bedroom community. That really accelerates after World War II, but after World War I, you do start to see more developments, particularly along light rail lines. And if you look at Arlington neighborhoods, you can see the development when subdivisions were built by following the major roads.
World War I not only helped the area itself develop, but also helped give women living in the United States more opportunities.
The Army particularly valued young women as telephone operators. There were also some that were used in the military that could actually become part of the military. One of the residents of the Ball Sellers house, Julia Reinhardt, joined and became a yeoman F for a yeoman female, which were sometimes referred to as yeomanettes. They were assigned to ships because yeomen had to be, but most of them probably never actually set foot on a ship. What they did was work on things along the naval base in DC, down in the Navy Yard.
She met her husband William Powell when he was working at a Navy yard after the war. He bought the house from Irene Young, and it would serve as their home for 49 years thereafter. Her service in the war, combined with the other women who served, helped bolster the women's suffrage movement, culminating in 1920 when women were finally granted the right to vote. 1920 was also the year when Arlington County was renamed, changing the county the House was on once again. Julia's niece, Marion Reinhardt, came into the picture in 1932 when she was orphaned at age 9.
Her parents were killed in the Midwest in a car accident. She goes to live with her aunt and uncle, grew up in the house, and there was a guy visiting his relatives in a house just on the other side of the fence. So it turns out they go to WNL, they go to Washington Liberty High School, at the time Washington Lee High School. Well, they met over the fence and they ended up getting married. Her aunt, Julia, dies in 1957. Will, her Uncle Will, dies in 1969, and he bequeaths her the house. In the meantime, she's already got her own home. She doesn't really want the house. She doesn't really need the house. She tries renting it out a little bit. It's just not for her. She knows how old it is. In 1974, the Arlington Historical Society gets a letter from Marion Sellers. She says, I have been the owner of this house, and I would like to give it to you, Arlington Historical Society. Arlington Historical Society was a pretty young organization at the time. It was only 20 years old, volunteer-based, no real funding, and frankly, the Arlington Historical Society was like, what are we going to do with this? Martha Orth, she and her husband and a large number of other people committed themselves to say, okay, we are going to do this. Cannot get rid of this house. They knew how special it was. So they raised money, door to door, bake sales, the whole 9 yards, to raise the money to refurbish the house. It was like $10,000. It's a testament to a commitment to history that is unusual now.